اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه واجعلنا من الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه وأدخلنا برحمتك في عبادك الصالحين. Dear brothers and sisters, tonight we're going to continue with the Usūl al-Tafsīr of Imam al-Dahlawi rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is the second chapter, and in the second chapter he talks about the meanings of the Quran. And in this chapter he tells us pretty much how the companions during the life of Rasulullah ﷺ understood the Quran, and how people later on understood the Quran. He says that during the life of a Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, it was very easy for the companions to understand. And they had very few questions they would ask the Prophet alayhi salam. But then later on, as the Quran was being spread and being taught in other countries, where the Arabic language was not the first language that people spoke, they were not very clear about certain verses. But even if they spoke the Arabic language, they were not very clear about certain expressions. Because in the language, you can, for example, you can study a particular language and you can have a communication, you can establish a communication with people, but then there will be certain expressions that it will be very hard for you to understand. The way how certain people from that particular culture they would express, you're not used to that, even though you may speak the language. So the Quran too has some expressions that, in order for a person to really understand the meaning of the Quran, they also need to know those expressions. They need to know the expressions that were used particularly during that time. During that time when Prophet ﷺ was around with the companions. Otherwise, for somebody to simply say that I understand the Arabic and because of that I'm going to understand the Quran too, that is not the case. That's not necessarily the case. So nowadays you may have even Arabs, some parts of the Quran, to them definitely they will understand most of it, but there might be parts here and there where they may have questions, or they may need to refer to other tafsir books or ask scholars in regards to those expressions, and let alone those who do not speak the Arabic language. But again, here Imam Dahlawi in this chapter, he is not saying that the Quran was only made accessible and the people were able to understand only during that time, and then later on everybody needs a teacher, everybody definitely needs a tafsir. That is not the case. Because the Quran, the miracle of the Quran is that people of different layers in society, whether you have educated people or people that are not that educated, you have simple laymen, or you may have people who have degrees, they are very professional, they will all find important verses and important meaning in the Quran that they can relate to. That is the miracle of the Quran. And it is also valid for all the generations until the Day of Judgment. Whatever Quran prohibits is going to remain valid until the Day of Judgment. Whatever Quran permits, it's going to remain valid until the Day of Judgment. And many of the verses that talk about history, that talk about science, that talk about human relations, verses about guidance, and so many of these things, they will always be the source of inspirations and source of guidance for the humanity. And as I said, Quran will always serve that purpose. As the Quran from the beginning, it says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. It will serve the main purpose, what it is revealed for, which is guidance for humanity. هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, guidance for the righteous people. So it will always do that, it will remain a miracle in that sense. So instead of going over many details, anybody who's interested to go over the details, they may go over the details of that chapter, but this is what pretty much he's trying to say in this chapter right here. Or he's given, for example, a few other layers of this. Sometimes it says the reason for not understanding the meaning is that one thing is substituted for another. For example, there are verses in the Quran. Where you may have even naskh or mansukh. We will learn that later on, inshallah. There might be a verse that it was cancelled. The command that may exist in a particular verse, it was cancelled because another verse later on came that cancelled the command of the first verse. But somebody who may not be familiar with the science of naskh and mansukh will not be able to really understand what's happening there. And of course, these are not a lot of verses in the Quran. There are a few of them, as a matter of fact. But people, they need to be aware of these details. Or for example, you may have in certain places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about وَقَالَ اللَّهِ or وَكَانَ وَعْدُ اللَّهِ. You know, the verb kana is in the past tense. But Arabs back then, they would use this kana or qala, it was or he said, in the present tense and in the future tense too. It can take any of these tense. They didn't necessarily say always, say yakun, for example, in the Arabic language, it will be. No, it was. They just used one that it could refer. So people, they had to kind of find out themselves. They had to find it out themselves. So that's what you have in the Quran a lot. Or sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would refer to the third person. Instead of being, I, but it will refer, Hu Allah, Hu Allahu alladhi. And somebody who is unaware of certain, I would say probably, certain cultural nuances, or the speaking nuances of the Arabic language, they would say like, okay, so here it's another person talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I was reciting tonight, Hu Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa hu. So here he is saying, it is He, God, the one who has no other partners beside Him, no other deities beside Him. So somebody can easily say, somebody who doesn't understand the expression here, somebody who doesn't understand the culture as well, that somebody who is important would not talk about himself all the time, but he would say him. Even nowadays, in some traditional places, they still use this kind of a culture. It still remains there. I know that for a lot of people say like, what? If I need something, for example, I would say, I need this. No. But culturally, in the Arab culture, back in the days, somebody who was dignified would say that he needs this, instead of saying, I need it. He needs it. They would not use. Even in the academic, in academia, to be a proper writer, when you do analysis and critical thinking and you name it, all that kind of stuff, you don't write I. It's not good. Informal, that's a different story. But formal, you don't write I. But you state your opinion in a different way, without skipping the word I, for example. So that too in the Quran does exist. Hu Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa. So as I said, it is related to the culture and it is related to the language as well. It is related to the way of expression. But again, the person needs to know these elements in order for the person to understand the Quran clearly. These things were very clear to the Arabs back at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But nowadays, some can even be confused when they're reading this scripture. And definitely, scholars, they need to explain this, and there are books of tafsir that can explain. But as I said, it is not fair for us to say that, Quran definitely needs somebody to explain it to you. No, because you will find most of the verses of the Quran very easy to understand and very easy to apply. But there will be certain verses, that may require. So, and the Quran is different from many other books out there because of these nuances that do exist. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us among those who understand the meaning of the Quran. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barik ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.